class. So today we're going to be talking about chapter 11, and it's titled Neoliberalism and Beyond, and it's the last chapter of the book. So let's talk about neoliberalism. After the Cold War came neoliberalism because the United States, they break up the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union leaves, and the superpower of the world militarily and the champion of capitalism is the United States. The collapse of communism in Europe and the liberalization of the Chinese economy made capitalism the only game in town, they say. So neoliberalism is new generation of liberals. Neo means new, okay, for new people, but with the same ideology of the liberals. In the 1990s, every president was neoliberal. Fernando Enrique Cardoso is a former professor of sociology. They say he's a Marxist. He was elected in 1994 as president of Brazil. And capitalism was the only game in town at the time, so Latin American nations will have to play it to win, they say. And the Peronist leader, twice elected president in Argentina, governed as a neoliberal. The same with the PRI in Mexico, right? The presidents of the PRI in Mexico. Neoliberals sold off and privatized the state-run corporations. And all the public services that nationalists created to be, part of the government, they are becoming private again. And the free trading neoliberals slashed the import tariffs. They've deregulated capital flows. They removed limits of profit on multinational corporations. So they're making it very nice for the foreigners, right, to invest and make profits in these Latin American countries. They reduced or removed the nationals-inspired subsidies that made food and public services affordable for the poor. So it becomes worse, the situation for the poor, as they will start working with low wages and there are no subsidies for food or public services in many of these Latin American countries. The neoliberals did better with the debt crisis that started in the 1980s, and Mexico and Brazil were overwhelmed with debts. And they stopped payments temporarily in 1982, and the debts to foreign banks as a whole rose from 105 billion in 1976 to 397 billion by 1986. In 10 years, it tripled, more than tripled, with Mexico and Brazil owning the most, right? They were owing the most money. And foreign leaders like the International Monetary Fund thought the solution lay in free market policies. And to encourage neoliberalism in Latin America, foreign lenders gradually rolled over all the debts that were external of one country after another into long-term bonds. And the debts continued to increase in the 1990s, but now the borrowing countries were able to make the payments. And the IMF also insisted on reductions in social spending. And neoliberalism curbed hyperinflation, especially in Brazil and Argentina. And the US investment comes with the US fast food franchises in major cities from Chile to Mexico. Very interesting. Do you see those buildings? They look really old and colonial style. Now they're McDonald's, right? Very, very interesting. In 1994, the creation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, helped Mexican neoliberalism. And in 1995, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay inaugurated their own free trade zone. It's called Mercosur, okay, so they can trade with each other. And the free trade of the 1990s allowed the middle-class apartment dwellers from Mexico City to Santiago, Chile, to access the internet, have satellite, like television and US or European television, and they become consumers in the transnational economy. And the reduction of tariffs lowered the prices on import goods, so people could buy more cars, VCRs, and cell phones. So one of the most common transnational operations was the Maquiladora. It's an assembly plant, and they use really cheap labor of women, and they put together imported parts. So the parts will come to Mexico to these maquiladoras with very cheap labor, using a lot of places women's labor. And all the parts come from Asia. They assemble them and they send the finished products for sale in the US. And this was really attracting the foreign investment because there was cheap labor environment, so they kept the wages down, even as food and transportation subsidies were withdrawn from the poor. So it's really bad for situation for the poor in these countries, like in Mexico. Chile was a neoliberal economic reform poster child. In the 1990s, they had low inflation and good credit, and they had a steady growth in the economy, and they diversified the exports going to Europe, European markets, Asian markets, and American countries. And the middle class benefited the most. The distribution of wealth remained the most unequal in Latin America, and the middle class grew and lived better because of their participation in the post-Cold War economic globalization. So that's in Chile. And today, a third of Latin Americans are middle class, and they say a third of them are poor, and a third are full of hopes and dreams, but still very far from being in the middle class life. And according to the 2014 statistics, the US economy generated over $54,000 per person. But Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, the economies will be around $12,500 per person. And in Colombia, $8,000. And in Bolivia and Honduras, the economy was less than $3,500 per person, right? And the poor became poorer. Like the rice, bus fare, they have to spend money on bus, clothing that are sold in bins, so they do a lot of secondhand, sales over there because that's what people can afford. Toiletries on the sidewalk, cheap toiletries that come in plastic bags, sometimes shampoos in plastic bags and stuff, and plastic buckets. So they would choose, this week we're gonna buy a plastic bucket, next week we'll buy a cheap watch, and then that's how they will consume. The poor people, they will take turns what to buy, right? What comes first? Rice, bus fare, and then the next week they will buy shampoo, whatever it is, huh? The neoliberal reforms reduce government spending to balance budgets and reduce debts, but at a social cost. So the poor are suffering. There was unemployment. And when the public utility companies were privatized, it imported its services, but the majority of the poor could not afford it without the government subsidies. And China also became a great player in the global market. They started buying raw materials from Latin America after 2000. So this generated a lot of wealth for Latin America, but it didn't really go to the farmers or the miners as expected, right? By 2000, Latin Americans were remembering why they had loved national leaders like, Lázaro Cárdenas, Getulio Vargas, and Juan Perón, right? Mexico's neoliberal president, Carlos Salinas, had earned disgrace for massive corruption, they say. In the years of 1994 to 1995 saw the worst economic crisis to occur in Mexico in decades, and the urban delinquency in the capital major protest demonstrations. Globalization failed to produce universal prosperity. So not everybody is gaining from all this neoliberalism and globalization. Poverty and social deprivation reached heights in Buenos Aires, and Latin America began to reject the neoliberal vision of free market supremacy by electing presidents who were nationalists in traditions. And socialism and revolution, the left, will replace capitalism and the well-being of the vulnerable above the logic of the capital, right? In 2002, the Brazilians elected Luis Inácio da Silva. His nickname was Lula. He was a former metal worker and union leader, and he really wanted to end hunger in Brazil. He created family scholarships, providing income and support for poor families as long as they kept their children in school. Isn't that a great policy? I don't know. He began to reduce poverty and encourage poor voters to re-elect Lula in 2006. The counterexample to neoliberal governance, right? In Venezuela, we have Hugo Chavez. He was a former army officer, and they say he was reckless and very outspoken. In 1992, there was a coup attempt against him, and then in 2002. But he survived the attempted coup against his own elected presidency. And he channeled resources to the poor, a form of patronage politics, in exchange for the support of his political initiatives. And in 2009, he won a referendum eliminating term limits for presidency, so he becomes a dictator in Venezuela, allowing him to be reelected indefinitely. And of course, his patronage politics and elections. And his death in 2013 left exposed his institutional weakness in deeply divided Venezuela.